As we wrap up a week of fantastic programs, Teresa has brought so much to our program to make it so much better. My personal thanks, and thanks on behalf of VA Warbirds of America. Also a shout out to our Living History group who have demonstrated the uniforms of the period and the different services throughout the week. I thank all of you for being here. And as I said, this wraps up an amazing week of Warbirds in Review. Sleeping Dog Productions, this film crew you see here. Paul Bowen, our still photographer, the best in the business, has been here all week. And my thanks to Scott Guyett, who is our producer. He's a phenomenal videographer, great person. Thank you to all of them. And to Kyle Guyett, my right-hand man, who's a real cute little blonde, but I'll call her my right-hand man. I could not do this without Kyle Guyett. Thanks to David Hartman for being here as our moderator, our writer. Sam Bass as a moderator this week, and to all the aircraft owners and pilots and all the other people, volunteers who make this a unbelievable event, but it could not happen without the funding and the sponsorship of Fagan Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls, who gave us this beautiful Quonset hut behind us, and to Scott's Miracle Grow Company, our friend Jim Hagedorn, who owns a P-51 and enjoys flying here, but he enjoys paying tribute to our veterans and supporting what we do. So to all of them, I say a big thanks, and to this program, it's fitting that we end the week on a high note by honoring the Tuskegee Airmen and their story. The red-tailed Mustang you'll see here, they'll be talking about that airplane and their story here in just a few minutes. But for now, let's lead this off with the video that you'll see on the Jumbotron. And thank you again.
Clear.
In early 1940, a group of engineers at North American Aviation in Southern California sat at their drafting tables with pencils and slide rules in hand and started designing a new fighter aircraft. Just 120 days later, they test flew the prototype of their creation, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was fitted with a unique-sounding Rolls-Royce engine and became what is considered to be the best propeller-driven fighter of all time. It had it all: power and speed, range, altitude, and maneuverability, the qualities needed to escort bombers over Germany in World War II, protect them from the Luftwaffe, and return safely to their bases in England and Italy. The challenge and mission was to confront and destroy Nazi Germany. Thousands of pilots flew the Mustang, but many of them had a second mission. They were African American pilots and had to fight two wars at the same time, one against the enemy in Europe, the second to fight racism, segregation, and social injustice at home. Those African American air crews became known as the Red Tails. Blacks fighting for America was nothing new. Thousands fought on both sides in the American Revolution. More than 80,000 colored troops fought in the Civil War. 33,000 died. When the Civil War ended at Appomattox, there were few jobs available to freed blacks, so many enlisted in the U.S. Army and fought the Indians in the desert Southwest. 4 black units were created, 2 infantry and 2 cavalry, led by white officers. They served with great courage and distinction. 18 received the Medal of Honor. The Native Americans dubbed them Buffalo Soldiers because of their curly black hair and dark skin and their tenacity as fearsome fighters. They went on to fight under Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. And when the United States joined the fight in World War I in 1917, more than 350,000 colored troops fought with America's allies in Europe, still in segregated units. One black infantry regiment became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And 171 of those soldiers received the French Legion of Honor for distinguished, meritorious service. 1 American soldier received the Medal of Honor. On February 19, 1919, after the war ended, the returning units marched up Fifth Avenue, and when they reached Harlem, the marching band broke into playing ragtime. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, there were already many African American officers and enlisted in the military, especially in the Army. But the Pentagon said that colored men were, quote, of inferior mentality, had smaller brains, and were unfit for combat, unquote. Therefore, were not fit to become pilots. Well, undaunted, hundreds, then thousands of young colored men enlisted and applied for pilot training. The government finally relented and created pilot and crew training for African Americans at Tuskegee Army Air Field in Alabama, near the Tuskegee Institute, which had been created by Booker T. Washington. By war's end, the program had produced nearly 1,000 fighter and bomber pilots and 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, and support staff. 4 squadrons of P-51 Mustangs became the most famous of those crews. And when they arrived at their base in Italy in 1944, they decided to paint the tails of their Mustangs red, so became known as the Red Tails. That group, the 332nd Fighter Group, served with great distinction, flying bomber cover and attacking Nazi targets in Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. They flew the longest escort mission of the war for the 15th Air Force in an attack on Berlin on March 3rd, 1945, 1,600 miles. In all, Red Tails flew a total of 1,578 missions, destroyed 112 enemy aircraft, and lost bombers on only 7 missions. Red Tail pilots earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. 84 lost their lives. 2 Red Tail heroes join us today. George Hardy, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. His wings were pinned on in September 1944. He flew 21 combat missions in the Mustang over Europe. He went on to pilot 45 B-29 missions over Korea, and later became a KC-97 refueling squadron commander. In Vietnam, he flew 70 missions as aircraft commander of the AC-119 gunship. He retired in 1971. Hardy is a command pilot. His decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with 11 oak leaf clusters, the Commendation Medal with an oak leaf cluster, and more. Charles McGee, Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. Eagle Scout, 9th in his high school class of 436. After 2 years at the University of Illinois, he enlisted. His wings were pinned on June 1943. He flew 139 combat missions in the Mustang over Europe, shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. He flew 100 missions in the Mustang in Korea, and in Vietnam, 172 missions in the RF-4 Phantom. McGee is the only American pilot to have flown more than 100 missions in each conflict, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He holds the record, which will never be broken, of flying, of all pilots, the most combat missions in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, 409 missions. After his 30-year career commanding at all levels, he retired in 1973. His decorations include the Legion of Merit with oak leaf cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 clusters, the Air Medal with 25 clusters, the Bronze Star, the French Legion of Honor, and many more. He is an inductee of the National Aviation Hall of Fame. This is Colonel McGee, and that's Colonel Hardy. So thank you, everybody. Afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome back to Oshkosh.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Charles, December 7, 1941, the day, of course, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Where were you on that date, and what do you remember about that day?
What I remember, I had gone home from school because of my birthday, but I was also with the Coleridge Taylor Glee Club, leaving Gary, Indiana, going to sing at an evening program in South Chicago. A few minutes after 4, we heard that message.
What birthday was that for you?
Oh my goodness, you challenged me to remember my math.
22.
20, well, to be 21, I think then, because when I got into the service, I was 22.
22. Well, it gets to the point, and we might as well get this out of the way right now. This December 7th, he'll be 100. And George, you're the youngster here in the group.
I'm only 94.
94. Yeah. So of the red-tail pilots, the Tuskegee Airmen, how many of you are left pilots?
Well, that's a number. I think we're down to 11, maybe 10. It's hard to keep up with.
No, it's 11 now.
He thinks
He's the
it's
oldest and I'm
11.
the youngest of that
So-
11.
Before Pearl Harbor hit, before that happened, what are your memories at your ages at the time, the attitude, the mood in the country before Pearl Harbor hit? What was happening in your lives?
Well, all I can remember is that I had parents and grandparents that go to high school, go to college, and really wasn't aware of that 1925 War College that said I was a subspecies of the human race.
Yeah, right. But George, what do you recall about what was going on in the country? What were you doing then?
Well, I was worried. I was in high school, say, and in 1941, I was a senior in high school. And the thing I remember was on December 7th, on Sunday, I was upstairs doing my homework. And I had the radio on low so my mother wouldn't hear it, to the Eagles football game. And they interrupted it to mention that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. But that's how I heard about Pearl Harbor.
So what happened in the days that came? What happened around you about attitudes about what was going on in the country?
Well, for me, the country had come out of 10 years of depression and the declaration of war to support our allies in Europe and the Pacific. Didn't change segregation, but everybody was interested and involved and had access to the jobs that were available in the war build up, the enlistments. It was a big change. As I say, it didn't change segregation, but everybody was behind the effort.
Right. And George, what was your
remember-
sense? You were in high school,
High school, but I remember Pearl Harbor. It galvanized the country, and I remember Pearl Harbor was the watchword for people. And everybody wanted to do their bit. In fact, I was in high school, and some of my classmates were 18. Enlisted in the service before they graduated. That is, they'd graduate, then go in, but they enlisted first because everyone wanted to join the Army or the Navy to fight the Japs. And I remember that.
How interested, if at all, were either of you in airplanes at that point in your lives, at your ages? Were you already hooked or not?
I wasn't one who was hooked, and I'd learned to handle a rifle in ROTC in college, but because I was in school, the draft board wasn't pulling my number. But when I heard about aviation opportunity, I was able to pass exams, and all I can say is, my first flight, I was hooked. So when somebody asks me now what got you interested in aviation, I just say I was avoiding the draft.
George, did you love airplanes as a kid or not?
Well, I built model airplanes because there was a time with the rubber band, you wind them up and they fly. I did that, but I didn't intend to be a pilot. It's one of those things. Well, let's see, when I was in high school, I only weighed 129 pounds, see? And I didn't consider myself a warrior of any kind.
But were you too light? Was 129 pounds too light to apply for pilot training then?
By the time I applied, I was 131.
Oh.
So I turned 17 the same month I graduated in June of 42. And it was in 43, the Army said if you're 17 and a high school graduate, you can take the exam.
Yeah.
So on St. Patrick's Day in 1943, I passed the exam and physical. I was sworn in as a private. And they sent me home until I turned 18 in June. And then I got orders to report to active duty. And that's it.
And when you went to active duty, though, then did you apply for pilot training at that
I
point?
applied for pilot training at Tuskegee.
Right.
And so I went to Keister Field for basic training, then to Tuskegee in September of 43.
Right.
And to actual pilot training. starting in December 43.
Right. You started to say something, Charles.
Well, I was going to say that it was just happenstance that I got into the flying. But as you say, after the first flight, I was hooked and knew I made the right decision.
So how did you get to the pilot training if it wasn't something you were really going after?
It's interesting, I had passed the exams to qualify and sat back waiting to be called. And this was April of 42. Didn't get called until October. And it's interesting, I'd met a young lady on campus, and over time we decided to get married, got married on Saturday. Monday morning's mail said, report.
Was that Kitten?
Well, her name was Kitten. That's why on my airplane, I named my airplane Kitten. But I also said my crew chiefs kept keeping that engine purring like one, so painted on both sides.
We heard in the video. Speaking of Mustangs, we heard in the video about that study that was done by the War Department, about Negroes, and saying they were unfit, they were cowards, they were unfit for combat. They were only qualified for menial work in the military and certainly couldn't be pilots. How did that strike all of you at the time? Because were you aware that had been written
Fortunately
and done?
for me, I wasn't aware. Were you, George?
I wasn't aware of it either at that time.
But you applied for pilot training, knowing, as you did, your life of segregation and injustice and all of that. And what were you both thinking about what it would be like when you got down to Tuskegee in the South?
For me, it was the first trip south, and that was an eye-opener for sure. But fortunately, when I went through in 43, I had classmates that let us know where you can buy gasoline, where you shouldn't go, and in town and that type of thing. So it helped that we had classmates who had grown up in the South and kept us from, who at that time were Northerners, kept us on the right track so we didn't get in trouble.
How much, George? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in South Philadelphia.
So also a Northerner.
So,
To what extent were you exposed to all of the segregation business and justice when you were growing up?
well, Philadelphia had areas of racial density in certain areas. And when I went to school, I went to one block to the west to an elementary school, all black, the teachers, the principal, and the students. Then junior high school, I went 2 blocks east, and 1 block north, and was practically all white at that school, depending on the neighborhood you were in. Then I went to South Philadelphia High School, which is south of me, and a class of 281, only 4 African Americans in it. So it varied growing up.
Right.
But that's the way the city was distributed as far as races were concerned.
Right. And Charles, what about you? How much were you exposed to all of the segregation and so forth growing up?
Well, life was interesting because I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but my dad's work took us away. My mother had passed when I was just about 2 years old. So school was segregated there, but when we went from Cleveland to the Chicago area, my brother, sister, and I were housed with the family out on the Fox River, not in Chicago, which was good. There was only one black family in town, and we were living with them, and so education was excellent, and also moved to Iowa, 2.5 good high school years there. There was segregation, but not in the school. There weren't enough blacks for a separate school, so that was good. And then my dad went back to the Chicago area. In Chicago, thumbs down. That wasn't so good because I didn't do anything for 5 to 6 weeks in a segregated school over what I had learned in Iowa, same classes. And I know they said that I graduated 10th in some 400 students, but that education primarily came from 2.5 good high school years in Iowa, not the Chicago school.
I'm sure Iowans like hearing that
I hope so.
today. So you enlisted knowing how segregated the military was. You knew about the things we heard in the movie. Yeah. So what was the passion in you that pressed you to go ahead and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make this happen, despite all the negativity?
Well, I had grown up, you know, you treat other folks like you want to be treated, and you take part in what's going on. The whole family ended up, my dad was in the service as a chaplain, my sister was a WAC, my brother went to signal school, I went to flying school. But it was all, as I say, the attitude around the country to me at that time didn't change segregation, but it was, everybody was interested in the opportunities that the war buildup meant for the country.
George?
Well, we get back to this thing of why did I want to fly?
Right.
And one of the things that impressed me was the Battle of Midway. You know, the capital ships were hundreds of miles from each other, and the planes made a difference. They ended the battle without the ships coming close and won. We won on that. And in fact, that was the start of the downfall of battleships too, because of planes. And that inspired me to an extent to fly. And in 1943, when I thought about flying off of a carrier, but the Navy wouldn't take Afro-Americans as pilots, but the Army and the Navy in 43 said, if you are 17, I went to the Navy first. I passed the exam, and they realized who I was, and they failed me on my physical. I said, well, what did I fail? It was my teeth, they said. My wisdom teeth weren't in fully. I went to the dentist and said, nothing's wrong with your teeth. See? Now, here, these are all my original teeth in my mouth now, say, in the Navy. So then I went to the Army on the 17th of March, and I passed the physical and the exam, and that's it.
So how much...
But it shows the racial problem in the Navy at that time.
Yeah. How much did your parents' values affect your values and your attitudes about realizing you could make whatever you wanted to make out of your lives? What was their influence?
Well, to me, as I say, I was glad to have parents and grandparents that said, get an education. In other words, go to high school, go to college, because then you're prepared to walk through doors that open. You don't want to go up to the door and knock, and the door opens and say, oh, but you're not qualified.
Right. George?
Well, the thing is that although segregation existed, my parents still felt this was a land of opportunity, and you can make it if you try hard enough. And they encouraged me, because my mother didn't want us to go to war, but there were 7 of us in the family. My older brother had gone in, and so I went in too.
Right.
But it's something she had to live with.
So you get down into the South, right, at Tuskegee. How much of that was an eye-opener for either of you in terms of how you were treated?
Well, it was certainly an eye-opener because you were facing things that didn't exist, at least as I say, where I grew up. And even though I went to the University of Illinois, there was some segregation in town, but the school was open. The opportunity was there, and so it was good to be able to take advantage of that. At the time, and as mentioned earlier, wasn't aware of some of the attitudes that existed, or those that were saying you can't do something.
Right. George?
Well, when I went into service in 1943, and I actually entered active duty on the 13th of July, 43, I met 2 other fellows from the Philadelphia area who were going to Tuskegee. And the 3 of us were put on a train to go to Biloxi, Mississippi for basic training. And they gave us Pullman tickets all the way, which was unusual. And it was nice sitting in a Pullman going to Cincinnati from Philadelphia in a dining car, seeing the scenery go by. We got to Cincinnati and got on the L&N Railroad to go to Biloxi, Mississippi. We still had the Pullman section for us. Everyone else in the car was white, but we had a Pullman section of 3 of us. When we went to eat was the first difference. They had to have segregation in eating facilities in the South. So the dining car had a heavy curtain across it with a few tables at the end. And we had to eat behind those curtains so that the white people couldn't see us eating in the car. That was my first introduction to real segregation. Then we got to Tuskegee and got off and went to Biloxi, and it was worse.
It was worse.
It was complete on the base, yes.
How?
We were completely segregated.
Describe.
Completely segregated. We had our own orderly room. We had our own barracks we stayed in. And Keister Field had thousands of people there, and they had about 10 or 11 dining halls, and we had one on the end for us to eat, that's all. And that's the way it was at Keister. The Army was rigidly segregated then.
Yeah.
Army and the Navy, all the whole military, yes.
So you're in basic primary, right? You're in primary,
No,
flying.
this is basic
Basic training.
Basic training, that is learning to be a soldier.
Right.
Using weapons and things like that, the
Yeah.
ground troop. Everybody in the Army goes through that.
Right. So you get to primary pilot training, though. What are you flying?
Well, I flew the PT-17 bi-wing open cockpit, but we need to say that our presence there was because of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. The city of Tuskegee and their sheriff wasn't a friend. If it had not been for Tuskegee University's very well-managed civilian pilot training program, and that's where Eleanor Roosevelt visited, if you recall some of that history, who knows what would have happened. And even the first white commander of Tuskegee Army Air Field didn't want a black soldier at the gate carrying his weapon because he didn't want a white person from Tuskegee coming out and being faced by a black with a gun. But fortunately, he was moved on. Noel Parrish took over. He didn't change segregation, but he believed in the opportunity and did everything to keep things smooth and continuing.
Right. So you're in the PT-17, right?
Yes.
So how long a period was that, and what was your next airplane?
PT-17, about 250 horsepower. That's primary training. Basic training was the BT-13, closed cockpit, a few more instruments, and you learned a few more things about flying. And the advanced training at that time was the AT-6, another couple hundred horsepower in your strength. But even along the way, somewhere there you learned night flying, you learned instrument flying, and then in the final phases you learned combat performance in the aircraft.
Do you remember your first solo?
Yes and no. Do you, George?
Not really. Not really, not really. It's so long ago. No.
What about when you were winged, when they pinned your wings on?
Well,
I just wonder what that experience meant to you, that's all.
Yeah, well, I remember more my very first flight when the instructor said, "You see over there the airfield they're building?" I think I said yes, but didn't want to be held to that.
So you're both winged. Now you come along later.
I came along, yes.
Yep.
He graduated in 43, I graduated in 44.
44.
September 44.
We were chatting inside about Benjamin Davis and Chappie James.
Yes.
Both African American leaders for sure. Where were they in that whole process, and how important were they to African Americans being able to fly?
Well, Chappie James was an instructor in Tuskegee Institute civilian pilot training program. And they were all, of course, civilians, and I was in part of my training. They wanted them to come on active duty, and they wanted to stay as civilians. So they were given a choice, and while I was still in training, Chappie James decided to come on active duty. So he immediately, because of his experience, he didn't go through pre-flight, he went direct to basic on through and graduated, and as you know his history after that, he strapped on many an aircraft.
Right. So you headed, once you've finished training, you get your wings, how soon before you went to Europe?
For me, training, we were immediately, Tuskegee Army Air Field was so crowded that our combat training took place in Michigan. Oscoda Army Air Base was a northern place where we could do gunnery out over the lake without much traffic and that type of thing. But we were combat ready by December 1943. Yeah, 1943. No, but I have to say that is the 332nd Fighter Group. The very first squadron that was an experiment expected to fail and didn't, 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they were combat ready in December of 42 when I first reported. No white commander wanted them. They kept in training for another 3 months. Spring of 43, they finally sent them to North Africa, tasked to the 33rd Fighter Group. Momeyer didn't want them. They went to their own base, sent a pilot over to the 33rd to get their briefing, came back and flew their missions. But he said, not aggressive, should be patrolling Liberia. Well, if you remember your history and your map, where's Liberia? Where were the Germans? I think you get the idea.
Right. But when were you shipped over to Europe, and how did you get there? When was that?
We were combat ready December of 1943. Went shipped over from the Virginia area and landed directly in Italy in January of 1944.
So how was the ship ride?
Well, it was interesting because they did a lot of twisting and turning. It was a slow ride avoiding the German submarines that were very active throughout that area at the time. And so it took several days to get over there in the troop ships that were moving the troops at that time.
So when was the first time you saw a Mustang? When you arrived in Italy, what were you expecting to fly?
Well, things get interesting when you look at the history, because I say the 99th was told they ought to do some patrol work. 332nd Fighter Group was combat ready in the P-40, and they said, oh, you are going to do some patrol work, and we switched before leaving the States to the P-39 Bel Air Cobra. We patrolled Naples Harbor and the waterways to the Anzio beachhead at the same time. The 99th, after they had moved out of Sicily into Italy, were doing the interdiction and ground support. And really it was over the Anzio beachhead that they shot down in a few days' time over a dozen German aircraft. So it was a matter of opportunity. But shortly after that, the 332nd Fighter Group was one of 4 groups picked to begin the escort work to protect American lives, because every bomber that was lost on the missions meant usually 10 American lives, and that's why the escort work began.
Right. So when did they bring in the Mustangs?
The Mustang came, when we started the escort work in the spring of 44, we had the P-47 Thunderbolt. 1st of July, all 4 squadrons were flying the P-51 Mustang.
Now, when did the red tail business start? Where did that come from, and what was it?
Because I was there before George.
Well,
Right, yeah, yeah.
The red tail was really the fact that the 15th Air Force assigned colors to the tails of each squadron.
Yeah.
And our rudder was supposed to be painted red. Instead, we painted the whole rear end red and became known as a red tail. But all of the airplanes had on their rudder a different color. So you could
Was that by
find them in the
squadron
air.
or?
Well,
by groups.
the key was that 15th Air Force wanted the bombing groups to know that these aircraft suddenly showing up are there for protection, not German. So one group had a yellow tail, one had candy stripe, red, white, one had checkerboard, 332nd Fighter Group, red tail.
Right.
And it's if you got involved in combat or something, once you started to form up, you could see at a distance who your squadron mates were and join up.
Right.
And that was one thing. But the spinners of all 15th Air Force planes were all red also. So.
I might say for the folks that are interested, if you notice here, red nose, red tail, but look behind the spinner, orange and red stripes here, yellow and the orange or yellow, whichever one you call it, trim tab. We ended up with 4 squadrons, and the crew chief needed to know what aircraft is landing to be prepared to take care of them. So what's happened behind the spinner and on the trim tabs allowed the crew chiefs to be prepared to bar shield on in. We had pier steel, plank runway, tent city on each side, the end of the runway. That was for their identification. What you see here happens to be the 302nd Squadron, the one that I was in. We had the yellow and red trim stripes.
So you know, we heard red tails, and we in the movie applied. It sounded like only to the fighters, but the red tails applied also, right, to your bombers or not?
No, just the fighters.
Just the fighters. So that's why we say when you're just talking about red tails, you're only talking half of the outfit. The bombers didn't get into combat, but they really fought what the Pittsburgh Courier called double victory. We were fighting against victory against Hitler in Europe. We were fighting against racism here at home. And 101 of the officers of the bomb group actually were incarcerated for a period because the commander wanted to maintain segregation, although the Army had already said it should end.
And the red tails did not apply to the 99th Fighter Squadron when they're flying P-40s. Because the red tails was assigned by the 15th Air Force. The 99th was in the 12th Air Force. And when we got to the 15th Air Force escorting bombers, the 15th Air Force assigned the color. Yeah. And that's when we started the red tails.
So when you were up escorting our bombers, to what extent did the bomber crews know that the red tails were Negro pilots?
Most of them did not know. Many of them didn't even know till well after the war. There was one squadron or small group that, due to weather, landed at our base in Ramatelli, and for a few days before they could get back home. But that word did not spread. Segregation had gone overseas and was pretty well maintained. We did not go to the Isle of Capri to the officers' rest camp. We had our own camp in Naples and that type of thing.
So most of those bomber crews, even on the same base, didn't know that they were being protected by colored fighter pilots.
That's what many didn't know until well after the war.
Wow. Is there any real way you can really prepare for your first combat experience?
Prepare for it?
Yeah, how?
No, they just sent you on the first mission, and that was it.
Well, I mean mentally, emotionally for you.
Training was good.
Training.
I've often had youngsters say, were you scared? And I said, if you're scared, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah.
But we had excellent training, and so it was a matter of carrying that out, whatever your assignment may be.
Describe one of your escort missions. What were they like?
Well, the escort missions were, they were long to start with. And that's the reason I didn't go as long one as most of them. Like the mission to Berlin, I wasn't on that. That was the longest one we flew.
Right.
But I flew as a wingman. I was a second lieutenant and flew as a wingman on that. And my job on a wingman in a flight of 4, you have the flight leader and the element leader. And the wingman, their job is to protect that plane. If he goes after a fighter or something, you stay behind him to make sure no one gets on his tail. That's the job of the wingman, and that's how you learn what to do in combat.
Yeah.
So you both survived World War II?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And move on with a few years. You decide to stay on active duty, Charles, and on to Korea.
Yes.
So
Well,
what were you flying in Korea?
I'd gotten over a couple of assignments in the States and ended up in the Philippines when the war broke out. And they grabbed P-51 pilots wherever you were because we didn't have our jets in place at that time. And 2 squadrons that had flown the 51 but had turned them over to the Philippine Air Force. They were flying F-80s. 2 squadrons of the group there were immediately shipped up to Japan, where they had 51s in storage, and got. So my last flight in Europe was November 44. 1950, 49, 50, or 1950, I'm going down the runway in Japan in the 51 again, and we flew missions out of Japan while they built the first strip inside Busan perimeter.
Wow. And George, you left active duty and came back on, right?
I got out in 46, went to NYU for 1 year,
Right.
and returned to active duty in June of 48.
So what did you do when you were back on active duty?
Well, when I
during
came back
Korea?
on active duty, I signed in January 48. I decided to go back on active duty, but Lockburner said, I'll go back if you can let me finish that semester at NYU. So he said, okay, I report in June. But in April, the United States Air Force announced they were going to do away with racial segregation. And that caused me to think more about going back on active duty. So I figured when I went back on active duty, I've got to fly. But if I can't fly, I don't want a desk job. If I had a desk job, it's got to be in maintenance around airplanes. Yeah. So I decided when I go back, I'll go into maintenance. What can I do? I know nothing about engines. In fact, when I finished flying, I had never driven an automobile. So I didn't know anything about engines and things like that. So I decided to go into electronics because when segregation took place, integration, I wanted to fly the all-weather fighters, and I knew they had radar. So I asked to go to radar school, and they approved it, and I went there in September 50 for 50 weeks and came out knowing everything about radar, how to operate it and how to repair it, things like that, and I became a maintenance officer.
So, and you were but you went to Korea, yeah?
Well, what happened was racial integration took place in the end of June 1949. The 332nd was deactivated, and within weeks, everyone at Lockburn received orders, Air Force bases all around the world. Well, I was still in school. I graduated in August, and I was shipped to the 19 Bomb Group on Guam as a maintenance officer, a B-29 outfit. And so I supervised the maintenance of electronics and long-range navigation equipment, but as a pilot. So I demonstrated I could fly the B-29. So in 1950, I was put on a flight crew, combat crew, and I flew that. I still had my day job, but I flew as a co-pilot. And when the Korean War started, we moved from Guam to Okinawa, right, and started flying out of there.
But the lesson, never give up your day job?
That's right.
Well, I had somewhat the same experience because just before integration, they said you need to do something else but fly, besides fly. And I also chose to go to weather school and intelligence. I went to the maintenance course, officers course, and those, like George, much of my career then, although I actively flew 27 of my 30 years, many of my assignments are in the materiel and maintenance support.
Wow. Now you flew what, 100 missions in Korea in the Mustang?
In the Mustang, 100 missions, and then chose to go back to the Philippines to enjoy my overseas tour, and got my first jet experience.
What was that like?
Oh, wonderful, because you could go, we didn't have that much thrust at the time. You could hold the aircraft on the ground with 100% power, but release and be up at 20,000 feet a couple minutes later was a real thrill. But
what was the jet?
The F-80 Shooting Star, and also it's my first chance to be a command, and I commanded the unit for 2 years.
What was the attitude of the pilots and the entire staff of the squadron under you as the squadron commander?
Well, fortunately, we got along well. Being a pilot and a maintenance officer, but the camaraderie that we had as fighter pilots, a little hard to beat. Our story is, we're the boys of the 44th, who in the hell are you?
One story, tell me about Frank Borman. When you were at Clark, Frank Borman, who's become rather famous in astronaut world, but what was your experience with Frank? What was so significant about that?
As I say, I was commanding the 44th. Frank was a second lieutenant and had been assigned in the command. He did some work for headquarters for a period, and had come down to the squadron I think we're planning for being able to build up support for moving transport. He was assigned to do that type of thing, but he had a problem, and the flight surgeon had been taken off of flight status, and the flight surgeon wasn't helping because he said he didn't have his records. So fortunately, I was able to get with the flight surgeon and say, if we take him up, give him some flights and so on, you monitor, and it worked out. He got him back on flight status. So Frank and I have been friends ever since.
The fact is, Frank Borman credits him with saving his flying career, which is pretty neat, for sure. Back in the States, when did you come back and become a base and or wing commander in the U.S.?
Well,
mainland?
That's interesting because for many years, after the Air Force integrated and closed Lockburn Air Base at that time, 1949, and we were scattered around the world, it was, I guess, like doors open at times. I had other commands overseas, but not here at home. But in 1972, I became
Would you like to go up and fly that?
That's a great sound, but we can't compete with it.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Oh.
So go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, let's see, where was I?
Command back in the U.S.
Oh, yes. We got commands overseas that we weren't getting here at home. But when I became commander of Richards Gebaur Air Base and the 1840th Air Base Wing in 1972, that was the first stateside assignment at that level in the career since the closing of Lockburn Air Base. Well, that was the Air Force attitude, and of course they led the country in the integration of military facilities, but used people based on training and experience and where needed, not their happenstance of birth, and using their money the right way, because segregated base limited them the ability to sign and grow like they wanted to. So that's what brought about the change.
Good. Let's wait a second. We're about to be jetted again here. Just 1 second. F-22 thing. Yeah. Oh, is he touch and go, or is he landing? Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe he landed. Yeah, that'd be darn. Go ahead. You started?
No, I finished, I think.
Oh, that's good. But on to Vietnam. You had all this experience as a commander here in the stateside, and then Vietnam hits. What was that assignment when you get a command assignment there?
Well, I always liked working with people, and of course, my experience besides just flying in the material and support area was a great opportunity, and one that I enjoyed because I liked people and the attitude of accomplishing the mission. Focus was there, couldn't beat it.
How'd you like flying the F-4?
F-4 was fine, but you know, technology is what it's all about. I got F-16 ride after I retired, and somebody said, "How do you compare the F-4?" I said, "You don't." But again, technology is the key to our advancement program, and I think unfortunately too many of our schools aren't giving that knowledge to our youngsters to be prepared for the future.
Amen. George, Vietnam, you had earned, what, two engineering degrees by this point?
Yes, I got 2 engineering degrees in the service, yeah.
But you're back on that. You're back in the combat
Well, they
zone
needed pilots in 119, which is an obsolete airplane, but they made a gunship out of it for Vietnam,
Yeah,
and they looked for pilots. And I was lieutenant colonel then. I was returned to the cockpit.
right.
Now, I hadn't flown for 7 years. I was still drawing flight pay, but they said I must be ready, and so I got refresher course in 119 in end of 1969, and got combat training at Lockbourne Air Force Base, still Lockbourne then, and ended overseas with my combat crew in the 119 gunship. Our base was at Phan Rang in the southern part of South Vietnam. But when he got there, they took my crew away from me and gave it to a low-ranking officer. Now, all the airplanes, the squadron was at Phan Rang, but all the airplanes were at 2 forward operating locations, one at Udon, Thailand, and one at Da Nang. And I became the commander of the detachment at Udon for about 3 months, and then I moved to Da Nang. And that's why I served as commander of the detachments over there, 119th gunships. And it was a good gunship, I thought. We had 4 miniguns out the side, but 2 20-millimeter Gatling guns, that's 6 barrels, firing a large 20-millimeter shell. And they could fire up to 100 shells a second out of those 6 barrels. And we had 11 people on the crew, and the person who fired the guns was the pilot flying the airplane. Of course, you had the guns were fixed, and you had to aim the airplane. So the pilot had a gun sight right here, and you had a crosshair with the guns were bore sighted out so many yards out, and we'd fly at night. An infrared operator would pick up targets, trucks basically, and his crosshair would show up there, and the pilot had to get in the firing circle. If the firing circle was right, all shells would be, as you go around, in this area right here. And they would destroy any trucks in that area. And you have to get in what they call the firing circle. And the co-pilot had to maintain altitude, whereas the pilot kept the circle going and only gave 1 or 2 second bursts on the guns, because that's 100 rounds a second thing. And that could get any truck if you were aimed properly.
Charles, you look back on your Air Force career. What has this meant to you? Excuse me, George.
Well, it meant a lot. Well, my career is, I had 3 careers in the service. As a pilot, then I got maintenance, and a good portion of my career was maintenance when I got to SAC, Armament Electronics Maintenance. And I worked in maintenance on B-36s, which is the biggest airplane we have had. And then I went to Limestone, Maine, up there, but from there in 55, I went to Institute of Technology for 2 years and received a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. And then I went to Japan for a good tour of 3 years, and then to New York, Plattsburgh, where I became a commander of an Armored Electronic Maintenance Squadron. And that's when they took my flight status for.
Right.
I got my flight pay, but I had to be ready to go back. And while I was there, the Institute of Technology contacted me to go to graduate school. So I ended up in '63 going back for 19 months and received my Master of Science in Systems Engineering. So I got a full, and then I got a different career after that, because I went into Air Force Systems Command, design development of worldwide programs. I worked for that for 5.5 years. At the end of that, I ended up going back to the cockpit and into Vietnam.
What's meant to me is the importance of us mentoring our young people for our country's future, and what's happened. In my own lessons, my son had when he was graduating, his mother was told that he might make a good truck driver. Well, he went to college, got an aerospace engineering degree, is a retired Continental and other
So that was, repeat that, what your son went to, repeat that?
My son was told he'd make a good truck driver, but he got an aerospace engineering degree became an airline pilot after some Air Force service, retired with over 31,000 hours, and now is an instructor for Boeing and the Dreamliner, the 787 and 777. But part of that experience, I can remember when I wanted to get out of military flying and go commercial, they didn't want me or women. It took some lawsuits to change that, but by that time I kept getting good assignments, and I say was still flying, so it's thing. But I think what's important and what I gained from that is that how we mentor our youngsters for our country's future, and we need to all be about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Charles McGee and George Hardy.
Wow.
Okay. And please welcome Sam Bass. He's got 35,000 hours and 50 years of safe flying behind him, and Alan Miller, who's a Mustang guy. And Sam, you're up with
Alan?
the guys.
Now, hold this up close to your mouth. Alan, you fly this airplane, P-51, that says it's a C model. Just tell us what's the difference between an A, B, and a C, and a D.
Well, the A model was the first model. It had the Allison engine, and the aircraft just didn't perform that well with the Allison. So then the B and the C model look identical, just like this. They were built in two different locations. That's when they introduced the Merlin engine. That's what gave the aircraft its performance, where it could go deep into Germany and escort the bombers. The D model is sort of the iconic Mustang that everyone's used to. You see the majority of the Mustangs here have that canopy that you can see out of. So if you look at this beautiful airplane, the C model, you see we call it a fastback. It just slopes down behind the glass. And these guys, some of them have told me that it was about 5 or 7 knots faster the C model was than the B model. But the thing I don't like about it is you can't see out of it as good. A D model, you've got great visibility. This airplane, you can't see quite as well.
Okay, give us a little of the specs on this, the engine horsepower, range, whatever, because it has an extended range.
Yeehaw. 1,490 horsepower, 1,650 cubic inch Rolls-Royce Merlin. They were built in the United States by some of the car manufacturers. The airplane's never exceed speed is 505 mile an hour. Depending upon the configuration of fuel, this one's got a little jump seat where the fuel tank was behind the pilot. They also carried drop tanks, so depending upon how much fuel they had, but they were the first ones that could go all the way deep into Germany with the bombers and stay with them. Part of that's because of the engine, this slim frontal area compared to an air-cooled engine like a P-47 has a lot more drag. The laminar flow wing, which is really, really nice, and also this scoop under the bottom, that's where the coolant system is. So it's just like your car. It's got a radiator, liquid coolant, and then the exit door in the back, and it was a genius design, created about 150 pounds of thrust, the hot air exiting out the back of that, in addition to what the engine did. So an amazing airplane designed by North American.
What was a typical armament you'd have on the airplane?
This one's got 450s, and the D model has 650s, and they would sometimes carry bombs. If you look at some of the D models out here, they have shackles underneath the wing. We've got a C model over there that's actually got beer kegs underneath the wing that they used to cool the beer.
Oh, yeah,
for
we
the
saw
troops.
that.
Yeah, that's not quite standard. But
Well, out of all the airplanes that were built, approximately how many are still flying over the world?
I think there's probably around 150 flyable Mustangs, probably 15 or so of the B and C models. They're pretty rare, and 1 or 2 A models.
Okay, now this particular airplane, give us a little history of it as far as its restoration and the paint job.
Okay, it's pretty much a volunteer effort. Redtail.org, you guys can go online there and learn a lot about this airplane. But we have a 53-foot travel trailer that goes around the country, tells the story of what these wonderful men here went through during the war and after. And we try to inspire children with that. We go to schools and air shows. The airplane's very original inside. We've got a couple updated things in it. It's been through a lot of trials and tribulations, but we use the principles that we try to instill with these children in the schools: rise above, aim high, don't quit, those types of things, and we keep it going as a volunteer organization.
obviously you don't do this for a living. You're a Delta pilot for a living, so this is a love of flying these airplanes. And tell us just, basically you've done it right now, what it means to you to fly these to these different events and have the people come up and look at it.
A lot of it's education to remind the younger people what these gentlemen and others did for us, not just the pilots, but the ground crew as well. The sacrifices they made during the war, the freedom we've got now, and how we need to protect it. We're trying to use the example of them to tell the children, give them some good role models. Some of the highlights are when you get to take one of these guys up flying. Harry Stewart, he's here at the air show. James Harvey's here at the air show. They both were two of the three guys that won the 1949 Top Gun competition. And the entire thing was swept under the carpet by the Air Force. I flew Harry in Atlanta about 3 years ago, and it was incredible. He flew the hell out of the airplane. It was amazing. I had to rein him in a little bit, but he was fantastic. And we came back, and I think both of us teared up a little bit. It was incredible. And Alexander Jefferson's a good buddy of mine. He flew his last flight ever in a Mustang over his hometown of Detroit in the back seat of this. So that makes all the time we spend on the road worthwhile.
Must be kind of like riding a bicycle. You never forget, right?
These guys don't forget.
No, they
You know,
don't.
they hadn't flown in 30 years.
They,
and put them in
they
the
could
back
probably
and they
get
flew.
in there and say, well, that instrument doesn't belong there. It belongs down here.
Exactly. Yeah, we
Well,
can't
Alan-
turn our back on them because they'll get it fired up and go.
All right. Thanks a lot, Alan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Folks, a couple of final things here. We have some challenge coins here. And if you people that are not in the military don't know about a challenge coin is issued to another, if you give it to another military man, and he's supposed to have that, and you challenge him with that coin and they don't have it, then you have to buy all the beer. So for our veterans, we have these challenge coins that we would like to distribute. Now, a little pretty lady here with the hat, and she's going to be over here. We distribute them, and they come from the Fagan Fighters World War II Museum in Granite Falls, Granite Falls, Minnesota. Excuse me. Are you going over there now, Kyle? Okay. All right. And thanks a lot for coming. We really appreciate it.